Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our podcast. My name is Jorge Tamames, and I'm a PhD student here at University College Dublin's School of Politics and International Relations. In our first podcast episode, Professor Aidan Regan interviewed David Suskis. They talked about Suskis' latest book, Democracy and Prosperity, which is co-written with Torben Iversen, and discussed issues of inequality, social inclusion, and economic growth across the European Union. This time, our interviewee is also called David, but he is here to talk about a different subject altogether. In this case, it's David Farrell. He is the head of School of Politics and IR here at UCD, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and a former president of the Political Studies Association in Ireland. For several years now, David has researched the subject of deliberation and constitutional reform processes. Together with Jane Souter, he's the leader of the Irish Citizens' Assembly project, which was instrumental for Ireland's recent referenda on marriage equality, 2015, and abortion, held in 2018. The latest referendum that was held in Ireland, in May, witnessed voters overwhelmingly back a liberalization of divorce laws throughout the country. An interesting aspect of David's research is that most of us associate deliberative democracy simply with holding referenda and voting yes or no on a given topic. In fact, much of it has to do with an entirely different process, selecting small groups of publics that are subject to deliberation. These groups are often chosen at random, provided with information, and then expected to discuss in a way that is conducive to both a productive debate and to their changing their opinion on a given subject, if they are convinced. They then provide recommendations that political parties in Ireland have to take into consideration. I talked with David about these issues because they have much to do with the research goals of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence for the Study of the New Political Economy of Europe here at UCD. The key areas that we investigate are economic governance, protest and politics, and democratic legitimacy across the European Union. It is in this last area where the introduction of deliberative processes seems a productive way to engage with citizens in democracies that are increasingly affected by fragmentation, polarization, and political disaffection. So, without further ado, we'll jump into the interview, and I hope you enjoy it. So, David, thanks very much for joining us today. We're here to talk about your work on deliberative democracy. So I wanted to start with a very basic question. This is a subject that you've been working on for the past years, but it was not your original area of expertise, or how did you come to be interested in this subject?
Yeah, I've been working on it now for almost a decade, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't an area of mine in the past, so I fell into it by an accident, which is that my previous work was focused on electoral systems. Mm-hmm. So I've written a textbook on electoral systems, which is now in its third edition or something. And in 2003, I got this email out of the blue from a buddy of mine in British Columbia, in Vancouver, Ken Carty, who basically said, David, you want to come to British Columbia for a week to talk to a bunch of citizens about electoral reform? I said, yeah, what's not to like about that? So what happened is that they had set up a citizens' assembly in the province of British Columbia. This was the world's first citizens' assembly. 160 citizens selected at random, and they were there to discuss the electoral system. So they used my textbook. So when I arrived, I was sort of like a folk hero. They've been reading my work. And anyway, there were further citizens' assemblies in the years following in Ontario and in the Netherlands, all of them focused on electoral systems, all using my textbook and all inviting me. So when I came back to Ireland in 2009, having lived in Britain for 20 years, and came back in the middle of our economic mess and deep crisis, citizens' assemblies was sort of foremost in my mind as a possible thing to think about.
And I imagine I am interested in the subject among other things because you worked and were a student of Peter Mayer, mm-hmm. right? The Irish political scientist who famously made the case in his 2013 book, Ruling the Void, of what he called the hollowing out of Western democracy, yeah. right? And he sort of explained how economic and social and technological transformations had led basically to a process of, to an extent, deinstitutionalization of
Western political systems, mostly through political parties that have been the guiding actor in politics in the post-war period, but had become increasingly irrelevant. But you could also say a similar thing of other institutions such as labor unions and so forth. It seems that in this juncture, deliberative democracy offers a pathway for citizens to become more engaged now that the traditional structures of politics have become eroded, and perhaps, a way for liberal democracies to reclaim some legitimacy vis-a-vis their citizenship. Do you think that is the case?
I do. And I mean, I was very fond of Peter Mayer, and he's a wonderful mentor figure to me for many years. But I disagreed with him on this one. I disagreed with him that things were quite so dire. He was very much glass half empty.
Yes.
I think, as some of his better friends would remark, he probably spent a bit too long living in Italy in his final years, and having seen how bad democracy can be, that probably coloured his own views. So in his book, he does refer to deliberative democracy, but dismisses it out of hand as, not really serious and not enough of a response to the crisis that he outlines. And I think he's missing something. I think he's missing an important point, which others have made. I'm not alone in making this argument, that democracies innovate. So he's talking about some sort of golden age that probably never existed. Democracy
the
was
age of the Cardinal Party in the post-war years.
And he goes back further than that.
Yes.
And, he's thinking about a sort of vision of democracy when, there were beautiful flowers and nature was clean and, we were all happy party members and we went to our party branch meetings and we voted in elections and we, gave due respect to politicians. It was never like that. In no country was democracy ever in that way, that ideal as often portrayed in the past. And equally, democracy is not as bad as people like Peter Mayer would argue that it has become. It's been challenged, but this is not the first time democracy has been challenged. And yeah, I think deliberative democracy is one of the solutions, one of the kinds of innovations that can be done to try and address the needs of modern day citizens in a modern day society.
And it's also a process that has taken off very much so in Ireland, more than in other European countries, right? So I think the most famous referendums were those on gay marriage and abortion that were held relatively recently. But as your work highlights, this has been going on for the last, 4 or 5 years, right? First with the Convention on the Constitution and then the Irish Citizens Assembly. And this is what you call the deliberative experience with constitutional mini publics, right? Where small groups of people are informed and they engage in a process of deliberation. So it's slightly different from what most people envision when they think of deliberative democracy, which is for the most part a referendum on a given issue, right? Could you explain a little bit how it worked in Ireland, this process for the last 4 or 5 years?
I mean, the thing I'd say, first of all, though, is deliberative democracy as an idea, as a theory, goes back decades and really comes to prominence, I suppose, about 30 or so years ago, and some very key authors involved in that. And then the development of the notion of mini publics, deliberative mini publics, goes back to, the end of the last millennium, the start of this millennium. So citizens' assemblies are just one variant of deliberative mini publics. And the constitutional mini publics, as you refer to the Irish case, are even a further variant of that again. So the way I always describe it is we're at an experimental stage, and Ireland is leading the curve right now in terms of some experiments, but we're not the only country doing that. How we ended up with it, I mean, it starts in 2009 with the crisis. It starts with a desire on the part of many people that we needed to start having a serious debate in this country about the crisis that we had. It was the worst economic crisis in our history. It was a severe political crisis as well. We had a major turnover of political parties in our parliament in the 2011 election. There was a sense of something needed to change. And so many groups, many actors were in this space pushing for reform. And political scientists like myself were saying from 2009 onwards, we have some ideas about how you can bring the citizens, the angry citizens who are on the streets, bring them into the room and let them engage with some of these debates about how we can fix our political system. So we got some funding from a private source, from Atlantic Philanthropies, to set up our own activity called We the Citizens, which allowed us to set up Ireland's first Citizens' Assembly in 2011. And our mission was to try and influence how this could be done for real in the Irish case. And so what follows then is initiatives by the government in part listening to the sort of arguments that my colleagues and I were making, but in part in fairness to the politicians, because they themselves were thinking in an innovative sense. They themselves were trying to come up with new ideas, setting up a constitutional convention in 2012, and then setting up the more recent Citizens' Assembly in 2016. So Ireland is certainly, as I say, ahead of the curve, but there are other examples now around the world. In fact, it's bubbling up. Almost every day now we're hearing new examples in some part of the world.
I think it's very interesting how you framed that this was largely taken in reaction to the 2008 crisis, right? And sort of the legitimacy problems that posed.
Yeah.
In my own experience, I'm from Spain, so we had a similar, legitimacy crisis after 2008 and so forth. However, there was, some petitions on a popular level for a more deliberative democracy, or to have more measures that could be, framed as direct democracy. And often, and at least in Spain, the debate, the way it run was these sort of initiatives are looked at with skepticism. And the argument is, look, mostly it's referendums that pitch an all or nothing question. They divide society along lines that do not really exist, or they force people to take a black or white stand. And furthermore, these are issues that politicians should be deciding, right? So you're just passing on the hot potato to the citizens, because then the politicians don't have to deal with it and take a stand.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think one has to make a distinction between different kinds of democracy here, right? So representative democracy is the main game. It's the election by citizens of their representatives in the parliament of some kind. Direct democracy is bringing citizens into the equation and asking them to vote on a binary question. And the new ingredient is deliberative democracy, which is saying before you have a piece of legislation in your parliament, or before you have a vote by your citizens, let's have a deliberative process, and let's bring citizens into the room for that. And that guide your referendum or your piece of legislation that's going before your parliament. So deliberative democracy is something that could be inserted into either of the other two models. Because I agree with you, direct democracy has all sorts of dangers. Referendums, in an ideal world, I would not want referendums. But unfortunately, in our system, under our constitution, the only way you can change our constitution is by a referendum. That's the way it was established. So we're forced to work with that. But in an ideal world, I would prefer other methods than referendums. They're very, very clumsy. But I'm interested that you talk about the Spanish case. I mean, in the same year that was happening, Belgium was going through the same turmoil.
Right.
And there were groups, developing arguments there about needs for deliberative approaches to try and resolve this. In particular, a group called the G1000. And it's instructive to see that these three countries now are three cases where we're seeing some of the best experiments. So the Irish case, which we're talking about today, in Spain, there may be other examples I'm not aware of, but Madrid is fascinating.
Right, in terms of municipal participation.
They've established a permanent citizens' assembly now in Madrid. Mm-hmm. So the Madrid city government have now set this up. And almost at the same time as that's happening in Madrid, the German-speaking parliament of East Belgium has just established a permanent citizens' assembly there, which was informed by the G1000 process a decade earlier. So these processes may not have, that started in 2009, 2010, 2011 in different countries, had different ways of breaking through. We were kind of lucky that we broke through very quickly. Mm-hmm. Other ones have taken a bit longer, but I think they're beginning to see some traction.
And one of I think, which is very interesting in some of your work, you highlight that exactly the difference between just a referendum and having a deliberative process is that you select small publics and you expose them to a deliberative process. They talk with experts. They come with an open mind, so to speak, even though they might have preconceived ideas, and they are in an environment where they can discuss their views and so forth. And in fact, you make the case that actually some of the referendums that have been retrospectively viewed as a huge mess, so for example, Brexit, could have been avoided if you had a previous deliberative process before the referendum, right? To at least frame the subject in a way that was more conducive to a debate that was not as black and white, not as morally wrought, and more informed.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, what I always say, and again, it's not me saying this on my own, others will say the same thing, is, to go back to what I was saying earlier on, referendums are far from ideal. Direct democracy has all sorts of dangers. And one of those is the binary choice at the end. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the ways you can try and improve a referendum process, and there are various examples around the world we could go into other than the Irish one if you wanted. One of the ways to do that is to think in more depth about the relevance of the question that's been asked in the referendum, and what the outcome of that referendum would mean in terms of what action would follow. Or to put it more bluntly, there's more to a referendum than the question being asked in the referendum.
Right.
And so the beauty of the discussion about abortion in the Irish case was that before the Irish citizens went to vote on the referendum in 2018, the government had already drafted the legislation that would follow if they voted in favour of the referendum to liberalise abortion. And that is the legislation that was then enacted. So the citizens, the media, the politicians, every actor was totally going in with open eyes, knowing that by making this binary choice on abortion, if they voted for abortion, these are the complex issues that were already agreed in advance. And that's the big weakness of the Brexit case. Brexit could have been done so much better, because we still don't know what people of Britain to this second have no idea what they voted for. Nobody knows what they voted for. Nobody knows what Brexit means. Brexit is what Brexit is the sort of mantra, which is utter crap and meaningless. So the only way in which it could have been better done would have been to have a serious deliberative mini public process in the lead up to it, and let that help to clarify the question, and more significantly clarify the nature of the Brexit process that would follow. And we know how that could have worked in practice, because colleagues in Britain organised a Brexit Citizens' Assembly. Unfortunately, it had to happen after the referendum. And, it was a private enterprise. They just got academic funding for this. And they were able to show that the sample of citizens that they got, and they sampled on the basis of how these people voted on Brexit. So they had the correct proportions of yes and no Brexit people in the room. And they were able to show that from the start of the process to the end of their deliberative process, the citizens quite quickly became aware of just how nuanced this was, how complex this was,
right,
and what the real decision choices were. And that just demonstrates, I think, really strongly just what a mistake it was by the British not to have done this properly.
Right. I'm pretty much convinced on this idea. I've always been sympathetic to the idea of deliberative democracy, but let me take the side of devil's advocate now and just ask. So I guess one of the objections that you could say is, look, this is all very good. However, there's some limits to what you're going to be asked to deliberate upon, right? And one of the examples you study, the questions were mostly framed by the ruling party at the time, right? And so what if the citizens want to deliberate on an issue that is more politically sensitive? Say on, I don't know, housing is a big problem in Dublin, for example. What if they want to take a solution that is not in the immediate interest of, let's say, the municipality or the government and so forth? What happens then? Is it that you can actually change things very significantly through deliberation? Or is it an instrument where you can tweak at the margins? But that would be one question. And the other one would be, I think, even though, of course, the referendum and deliberation are not the same, the most, the better known cases in Ireland involve the abortion and gay rights voting, both of which had sort of a progressive outcome that was largely viewed with sympathy outside of Ireland. But and this sets a sort of positive precedent. But what happens when you have, let's say, an outcome that is a bit more fraught, right? I could think of the example of Switzerland, where there's a tradition of direct democracy that is very robust, but sometimes the decisions that are taken are either just very conservative or sometimes just reactionary, in terms of anti-immigration or so forth. So what do you think of these two objections, I guess?
No, they're raising important issues. I mean, the Irish cases were experiments. That's what I will always say. Mm-hmm. So they're sort of moving the needle a little bit further down the road towards an ideal way of running a deliberative process, but by no means were they perfect. There were lots of mistakes, and one of the big mistakes was that the agenda was tightly controlled by the government, and the outcomes, the determination of what to do with the outcomes, was also determined by the government, so the government could cherry pick. So there were some recommendations by the convention and by the Citizens' Assembly which the government just outright rejected or ignored. Mm-hmm. And indeed, one of those was housing, because the Constitutional Convention in that first process, it was given the possibility to select 2 agenda items of its own once it had completed the agenda that it was set. And so it picked parliamentary reform and economic and social and cultural rights, and that latter issue included housing. And it made quite firm recommendations on the need to insert economic and social and cultural rights into the Constitution. And indeed, that is referenced in the attempt by the Sinn Féin party in the Dáil last week to put forward a constitutional amendment on the same issue. It referenced the fact that the convention had done this. And effectively what happened is the government just said, no, we don't accept that. So they ignored it. So that shows the weakness. However, two things I'll say here. One is that the other topic that they discussed, parliamentary reform, they came up with a series of proposals for parliamentary reform. So this was an agenda item the convention decided it would discuss. It then discussed it. It proposed a series of reforms to our parliamentary system, which was extremely weak. Mm-hmm. They've all been implemented.
Okay.
So in 2016, our parliament had radical reform and is now a much more influential seat of power than it was before. So that one got through. It isn't the case that the government necessarily stopped everything. But I suppose the other point I'd give you is, here's another experiment, the Belgian model. So the model I referenced earlier on in East Belgium for the German-speaking communities parliament of a permanent citizens' assembly. And what has been written into that model is that the citizens' assembly sets its own agenda. So it's a permanently, I won't bore you with the details.
Right.
There's all sorts of details about the rotation of the membership and how long people
stay. So it's autonomous to an extent.
But it sits alongside the parliament. Mm-hmm. It receives funding from the public purse, so it has substantial funding. And its job is to come up with agenda items and establish mini citizens' assemblies to discuss each of these items. And then the recommendations of that citizens' assembly are fed into the parliament. Now, we'll have to see how this happens in practice because it has literally only just been established in the last few months. So we've yet to see it happen in practice. But that's a solution to some of the Irish problems. So, this is why I say these are experiments and we're sort of learning as we go along. Now, your other point about referendums, I mean, that for me gets more to the issue about the weakness of direct democracy rather than deliberative democracy. Mm-hmm. Referendums are very dangerous weapons. You just look at the minaret vote in Switzerland.
Exactly.
As the perfect example of just how dangerous referendums as a device can be, particularly in those countries like Switzerland where citizens can petition for referendums. At least in our country, we don't have that. Mm-hmm. So that's one benefit we have, that it's not possible for citizens to come up with mad ideas and force a referendum vote on it. So we don't have that particular danger here. I completely agree. And that is why I would argue that it would be much better if you have to have referendums that you build in a deliberative process into the mix. So I'll give you another world example. Oregon, the state of Oregon. Mm-hmm. They have the equivalent of a citizens' assembly every time there's going to be a referendum. They call it a citizen initiative review. Mm-hmm. So it's agreed there's going to be a referendum in the state on a certain issue. A citizen initiative review is set up, and its mission is to produce a one-page summary of the topic that's being discussed. What are the positives, the points in favor, what are the points against, and that one page is sent to all the citizens in the state before they vote, so that they're informed about the fact that this is a document produced by their fellow citizens. So that sort of thing just gives a referendum a bit of a fairer wind. And that's the sort of way I think deliberative democracy can help direct democracy.
And it seems a paradox that, like, when people think of it, it seems a very spontaneous way of participating in politics, but in fact, it works better when it's highly institutionalized, right? Yes. I mean, I can see myself coming back home, making the case for this, and maybe one of the likely answers I would get would be, look, Ireland, great, but Eastern Belgium, Oregon, small political communities, right? To do this in a large country is just out of bounds. There's too much diversity, too many different interests that you need to balance, and we would never come with an outcome that people could agree on through deliberation. What are some other international examples that you could point towards in recent years that have been successful at these sort of initiatives?
Yeah. And I mean, by the way, that sort of criticism is so common. The three criticisms that are always made, the 3 points that are always made by critics are citizens are too stupid.
Yeah.
We already have an assembly, it's called our parliament. Mm-hmm. And, that might have worked in country X, but it would never work in our country for whatever reason our country is special. That's exactly the same arguments that were made in Ireland in 2009 when we were arguing for it. And that was why we went and got our own funding and ran our own citizens' assembly, so we could demonstrate that it could work in Ireland. But your main point is a valid one about most of the cases, in fact, all the cases we're talking about now are small systems. So could we envisage this being translated into a larger context? Well, yes, and why not? Why does the size of a population have to be the reason why one draws a line as to whether it's going to work or not? As I keep saying, these are experiments. We've got to learn from one experiment and see how we might try and improve it for the next. So we know Macron is setting one up in France, so it's going to be trial there. So there's going to be a large country that tries it. We know that there are discussions in places like Australia about the possibility of something like this. It bubbles up as an issue now and again. We know that in Canada there are some who sympathise about the idea that we might try it there for a debate about their electoral reform debates. I'll be discussing that in the next hour or two with a bunch of Canadians. So there's no doubt that people from larger systems are thinking about this. So why not is my answer. I suppose the other thing I would stress here, which is relevant, I suppose, to what might lie behind your question, is that a citizens' assembly is there to support democracy, the system of representative democracy. It's not there to replace it. And I know there are some deliberative scholars and some deliberative practitioners who would disagree with what I've just said. There were some who would say we need to throw out our parliamentary representative system and replace it with deliberative democracy, with sortition. I don't agree. I think it's there to support it. And in so doing, it's there to make recommendations. It's not there to make binding decisions. So if you pick 160 citizens from a massive population of 50 or 60 million, you're putting them in a room for a period of time, you're informing them and giving them as much opportunity as they can to get fully informed and deliberate on the particular issue. And what they will produce will just be recommendations. And that's all it should be. So I think that sort of reduces the risk that people might fear that there's a legitimacy issue here.
One last question that I wanted to ask you. You mentioned in your work that one of the benchmarks of whether deliberation is taking place is that these small groups that you select for deliberation, whether people are changing their opinion, right? So they come up with an idea and they're exposed to information and so forth, and then they might change their minds. And you're right. Deliberation is thought to work because it generates new information, but it also might mean the people involved engage with the information in a substantively different manner, right? So they maybe go out beyond the usual frame of analysis that they use to engage with subjects that they agree or disagree with. And the question is, I think recently in the last, since probably Brexit and Donald Trump's election, there's a lot of talk of manipulation in the public sphere, right? False information, fake news, and so forth. Are people truly informed well, or are they subjected to misleading information? Is this something that affects the deliberation process? Because the people that you work with these mini publics are small, but then you have to extrapolate to the larger population that will participate in these processes. So
it's a difficult one. I mean, and this gets to a question that's very prominent in a lot of the work of deliberative scholars about how you scale this up. How do you make this something that's really going to have a meaning effect more widely? And that's one of those conundrums that I don't think we've ever really come up with a proper solution to. All one can try to do is make sure that at least what goes on inside that mini public is done in a robust, transparent, and properly run way. So there's no question mark over the quality of the material or the bias or anything of that nature. That there should never be a question about any of that. Then how do you try to translate that to the maxi public, as we would call it, is not something that can be done easily. I mean, one way is through good coverage of what goes on. And we know from our research, from survey work that we carried out during the abortion referendum, that there's plenty of evidence that knowledge of the role of the Citizens' Assembly percolated to the wider population and had an effect on the yes vote. So at least how widespread the knowledge and the sharing of the by media and through social media of what goes on could be one way to do it. But other ways is to use new technology. So in the G1000 in Belgium in 2011, they experimented with online possibilities so that people who were not part of what was going on in the room could have what they call G-offs or G-homes, where you could be in your own room in your bed.
And you're following the debate.
You're following the debate at live streamed and you're engaging with fellow citizens elsewhere in Belgium in the debate. And I know there are examples, the people who are technological whizzes are really getting into the space. I've seen countless examples in Reykjavik, and there was some interesting work being done there when I heard about it in Iceland last year, of using the internet in a good sense for once to try and trial deliberative processes online.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll keep in touch and let you know when this episode comes out.
Thank you.